His name is Glen Heefner, and he's a technical writer who has authored many painfully boring software user guides over the last 20 years. Back in his college days, he always said he would someday write fiction. Why? Because, as he puts it, there's so much humanness I would like to explore. His work so far includes 6 short stories. The Reminder, which is the one that he is reading tonight, is the 5th of those 6. Now, this story is a tad bit longer than our normal readings, so I'm just giving you a heads up. He has been given special dispensation. So if it starts to feel like, hey, this guy is in Waterline, he's reading way too long, we gave him permission. Glen, please come on up.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Anne. Thank you, patrons, for being here. This is literary fiction, not genre fiction. It's a complete short story. It's titled The Reminder. I hope it takes you away. If any of my friends had been with me, they all would have agreed that I drank too much that night. Guilty I was, and I can prove it, as I let brandy, of all things, pass through my throat just to see what could happen with the redhead. The strange thing about this was I didn't like redheads much, and freckles gave me kind of a sick feeling back then too, despite that I have a few of my own. So why did I let her hang on me? Well, for one, redheads have a distinct and shameless, in my experience, proclivity for all things sex. For two, she did rest her hand on my thigh about 1.5 inches away from my stuff. This I know I'm remembering correctly because it occurred to me at the time. This distance is the thickness of a stud, and I privately snickered at the thought that possibly she thought she'd found one. I thought I was fairly good looking that night, worthy of the attention she was slathering on me. It had to do with the way my hair obeys in the wintertime, and the new Pima shirt that sat just right on my shoulders and cuffed out right where my knobby wrists wanted it to. Looking back, though, it was too much like having your ducks in a row. The fact you do doesn't mean you need to shoot. And there was one other thing that made the blur from all that brandy such a welcome lens. My pre-law classes weren't going very well. As a young man, I was very much of a mind that I should learn whatever I wanted to learn and ignore the rest. This was a phase, but I had thought it was a trademark. I made no bones about the difficulties with school, even told the bartender, who had no reason to care. So the only reason telling him makes any sense is that this was one of those personal facts one tosses to the world to prove how open and honest he is. Reflections on a trusted book always remind me, whenever I tell my story, that things like the trouble in my classes and the prospect of this hot companion. And let's throw in here, too, the fact that Veronica, whom I'd often referred to in those days as a godsend, had yelled at me that afternoon for a shameful indiscretion she was right about. That these were not reasons for drinking. That I drank for one single reason, the constitutional inability to resist the lure of alcohol. The jury is still out on this, but sobriety does feel a lot like coming home, and it's so good to be home. Being an orphan, boo-hoo. Being in hock for my education, oh well. But regardless of whether these were contributing factors, the things the other strangers did to me later that night wouldn't have happened if they weren't doing them to a blacking out drunk. I can still hear the bartender knocking the bottom of my glass against the bar and saying, I guess that'll be it. At that point, I leaned toward the redhead and mumbled, maybe some other night what? But she was already gone. Her coat, her purse, everything. Her leggings, her clever lips. I slapped the cash down, too much I'm sure, and gave my best rendition of an okay me in a wobble toward the door. I deliberately yawned to try to convince the good man, whose back was already toward me and whose mind was fixed on his register tallies, that I was only tired, as if I'd hoped he'd forgotten how much he'd served to me. It made him glance over his shoulder, and when he did, he hollered out, "Didn't I want that white lighter that I left on the bar?" No, I didn't, but the okay me thought I should go back and get it, because that's what a sober guy would do. A sober guy wouldn't have even bought it. When the redhead drifted out the first time to smoke, I jogged across to the quick stop and bought the lighter so I could be the gentleman who would fire up all of her next ones. White I picked for gallantry. White night. It got a lot of use. There's something in how a woman caresses your hand when you light her cigarette. It gives the man the sensation of being appreciated, and that's never been a small thing to me. A fresh layer of snow on the parking lot surprised me, and I slid around and flailed like Scotty Hamilton on steroids. This ineptitude must have shaken me because I sat with a gratitude grip on the steering wheel for as long as it took the defroster to clear the windows, and then I continued to sit a while. I remembered having told the redhead, whose name I still couldn't retrieve, we could build a fire at my place, how nice that would be. She made a peaceable groan, like the purr of a well-fed cat, and took another sip of her brandy Manhattan. So, now alone, I was trying to dial up a picture of whether I'd like a fire for myself when I got home. Operating the truck proved easier than I'd feared. Sometimes you get a little gift like that, the unexpected skill, and begin to contemplate what it might have been a Benny for. Was it for good behavior? For not taking the redhead home? At least for not taking her home without telling her about Veronica? Was it for not arguing back? For letting Veronica's verbal punches hit me without hoping she'd feel guilty for throwing them? Or was it a positive sign about me, an indication that my self-assessments are conservative, that I'm prone to think I'm more drunk than I really am, and this will serve me quite well in a future of marginal alcohol abuse? The competence to drive was a gift in any case. But like a nail without a hammer, it stopped being of use when the engine power fell in a steady taper. I recognized this as fuel pump failure and pulled to the only length of shoulder available, which was short, but long enough for me to get the whole truck off the road before it died. I turned lucid. Still 6 miles from home, I wasn't going to get there by walking, but I couldn't stick with the truck. So intoxicated like I was, there was no taxi service in town. There were a few near the U, but they wouldn't come all the way out here, I knew. I would have to appeal to someone to drive me. I'd start walking, get away from the truck first, then thumb. I got a couple hundred yards and realized if I'm carrying my keys and I'm wasted and my truck is a little ways back, this constitutes proof that I had been driving drunk. So I went all the way back to put the keys in the ignition. The second time, when I reached the sharp left curve sign where it had the epiphany about the keys, it dawned on me my house keys were still on the ring, dangling from the ignition. This was tough, very tough. To believe as I did, when you experience luck, a meter starts to run. And yes, ultimately, you will run out of luck. I knew going back a second time posed more than twice the risk of a DUI. I went anyway. But for the first time all night, I trembled all the way. That's why I was so glad when a van stopped to pick me up pretty soon after I grabbed my house keys. I might skate, I thought. I whispered, "Just call me Scotty," right before climbing in. I could smell the weed. These folks in the van seemed to be tying a good one on of their own, and more power to them, I thought. They had given me the seat by the sliding door. The driver was Dale, who smoked one after another what looked like shorty, unfiltered cigarettes. He introduced his girlfriend, Marta, who rode shotgun, and his kid brother, Eric, in the captain chair next to mine. There was something not right with Eric. I could tell by the way he kept grinning and laughing too long after each thing this group found amusing. His face looked a little off, too, although in the dark interior I couldn't quite tell in what way. But then, who was I to think that somebody else looked a little off? Then I found out they were on a mission. They were headed for Dale's brother's house. His brother was out of town on business. Dale's sister-in-law was having an affair. If the asshole was there, they would make him regret the whole intrigue. If he wasn't, they would make the sister-in-law abandon it. With every little detail Dale shared, Marta would half turn her face toward the back and smile. This made the whole sinister disclosure oddly agreeable to me, though of course it shouldn't have. There was something in that smile. Marta was not beautiful or even necessarily pretty. I had just never known a woman so possessed of the capacity to be okay with everything around her. If she were in charge, she would never have devised this brash visit, and if someone else suggested it, she would have decisively nixed it. But not being in charge, she could be at peace, even find the funny in the terribly unfunny. I found this almost unbearably attractive in her. And this is the only reason I can think of why I didn't protest when Dale crossed my highway without so much as touching the brakes, even after I said, "Hey, guys." It's not that I didn't try again to get home without becoming an accomplice to the scheme that so likely would have a bad end. I remember thinking, they resonate to silliness. So I deployed a measure of it. I said, as your lawyer, and yours, let me explain something about tort law. Dale, you be the party of the first part. No, the second part. This proved to me, in the same way it was proving to them, that the party of my part was still plastered. But Marta loved it. My legal nonsense triggered her sense of humor to dance in the moment. And that further charmed me. She teased first part and shoved Dale's shoulder, then no, second part, and did it again, then rested her palm on my knee. Her tenderness instantly roused me into an awakening far more sensual and sophisticated than the redhead's play had done. When I drank, I tended to exaggerate and treasure nearly all things for how amorous they made me feel. So I credited her with many other abilities she hadn't demonstrated. And having trusted Marta, I trusted, by extension, this whole bunch. When she and Dale began to whisper, I thought they were amused, so I poured it on. Your Honor, may my clients have a moment to discuss this turn of events? Thank you, Your Honor. But this time only Eric heard me. He slapped his knee and shouted, Your Honor, 3 times between his guffaws. Thinking Dale might have been plotting yet more devious ways to blow up his sister-in-law's stasis, I gave goofiness one more litigious shot. Let us turn to the constitutional rights of the party of the fourth part. Let us say, for example, she has cookies in the oven. But this, too, evoked no reaction from Dale or Marta. Eric started to bounce in his seat, and I found myself shushing him. I was getting either bold or frightened. Beyond a bluff on our right, the roadway offered a shoulder, and Dale pulled off onto it. Before he jumped out, he said he needed to fetch the flashlight from under my seat. I groped for it but couldn't locate it by the time he slid my door open. Marta turned toward me and whispered, "You'll be all right, honey," and punctuated her assurance with one of those ever-innocent smiles. Dale grabbed me just above my right elbow and tore me from the van, and then hollered over my head, "Eric, help me out here." Eric did, seized my left arm the same way. The two of them dragged me to a barbed wire fence and threw me over it. From the ground, I saw them each in turn, Dale first, Eric mimicking, step on the highest wire and bounce over it into the pasture. This had to be a sheep ranch. I knew roughly where we were, but because I did, I also knew we were tens of miles from help. They dragged me about another football field until, when Dale yelled, "Now!" they threw me face down onto the ground. And as they did, Dale kicked both legs out from under me, and my shins immediately felt like toothaches. I didn't try to move at first. The kick had told me they were not just getting rid of me, they were at least willing to risk that I not survive. So I played as if I lacked the strength to. I lay still and watched them the whole time, at first squinty, then wide-eyed, until they got back into their van and began to drive off. Then I let a few more minutes pass, just to make sure they weren't coming back to check on me. These minutes I used for regret, and then remedial planning. I would walk south, deeper into the pasture, hoping to find either a sheep shelter or a ranch house. When I finally stirred, I found my right cheek was stuck, frozen to the ground. Nothing I did to try to free my face caused pain because my face was numb, but everything about it scared me. Every time I tried, I failed. Success would mean trading my countenance, which at various times had been called unequivocal and magnetic, to win back my life. I would take a seat at that bargaining table if I had to, but not yet. My fingers were numb too, so to feel around for something, anything, I had to use the tops of my hands. This turned up a clump of sage florets the size of a baseball, which I pushed under my neck so a puff of wind wouldn't take it. This is when I realized I should thank Providence for the bartender's extra care. I remembered the lighter in my front pocket. I let a small laugh out at the fleeting thought that maybe the redhead's hand on my thigh was a grope for the lighter and was hinting nothing more than that. It dawned on me right there that a sense of humor is a gift. And maybe mine is not as big as Marta's, but mine could carry me, perhaps all the way out of this dilemma. I tried hot breath to loosen the hold the ground had on my cheek, but that quickly made it worse because the frozen area had broadened. I felt the whole side might become stuck, and in that case, there would be no tearing away, even if I resigned to losing a good deal of my face. Vision would be a problem, as dark as it was, but I had to find a nearby tumbleweed if there was one. It would take contortion, but I knew I had to use each hand in front of my face, which itself had no range to rotate. One hand would operate the lighter, while the other shielded my eyes from its glare. Excuse me. I was now prepared to declare something as being miraculous, because only 3 or 4 feet away was a good tumbleweed. I would light the sage and flick it to land under the weed. Not easy and utterly final. If it worked, the weed would burst into a modest ball of fire, short-lived, but big enough to be seen from some distance if anyone happened to be so near and looking this way. So I would wait. Maybe a car would appear. If not, I would hope for the impossible coincidence of some ranch hand having a gander out here right when the ball ignites. To this day, my friends don't believe the next part. They get that I waited and waited. They don't see honesty in my account of the thoughts I had while I did the waiting. I found it easy to be on high alert and still reflect on how I got there and how I wanted me to be if I were lucky enough to get out. Of course, I acknowledge the stupidity of drinking like a fish. But I also gave remarkable credence to a notion that the little signs of good cheer I'd observed from Marta had a lasting, settling effect on me, and that this may have kept me from altogether giving up. I'm convinced it made me ready and dexterous when headlights did hit the road above me. The driver was a deputy who saw my blazing tumbleweed and came down into the pasture. When I was able to hear her boots crunch, I grunted so loudly I didn't sound human. I'm not sure why I didn't use words to direct her to me, but I didn't have to. Once there, the good woman took my word for it and didn't try to lift me. She called the fireman she'd summoned and asked him to bring down some tools. "Fast, Johnny, fast," she hollered into her radio. I heard him come back with something garbled, but she answered, "Not vitals, not yet." It was only minutes before the fireman stood over me with a crowbar and a propane torch. By what I now think of as genius, he alternated punching deeper and deeper holes into the frozen ground near my head and shooting flame into them doggedly until the earth relented. The next morning, dressing to leave the hospital room, I found fragments of shearling from the inside of my jacket in the pocket of my jeans. So retrieving the lighter must have been strenuous, although I recall it feeling like only an exercise of a treasured privilege. The strands glistened in the sunlight. Severe frostbite had claimed a large patch of skin from my cheek. The tissue died forever in the shape of an upside-down pear. Several doctors and even more friends over the years have prodded me to have a graft procedure to fix it. But I'm still finding it easy to dismiss the urge to have that done. When the persistent ones ask why, I usually tell them I don't know, and that's mostly true. I walk away from the question thinking, though, how this scar is as much a part of me as any feature I carry from earlier in life. I have fancied it almost like a badge of honor, even though I don't see anything honorable in my behavior that night. I'll tell strangers it's a birthmark. My future eventually landed like a balloon losing air in the homeowner's insurance business as an adjuster, where claimants tend to find me a pushover, as I always work under the assumption they're telling the truth. Yet I'm at ease with this, knowing they are in charge of their realities, and that I only offer them possibilities. I stand beside an imaginary gate while they pass through or don't. Acceptance, I have come to think, is what lights up the path toward all the essential truths, from the gnarly to the simply natural. This I've never read anywhere but between the lines in the tale of my own young life, mine and Marta's. That's the end, folks. Thanks.